So we started last week with love your enemies. And so I'm doing this part 2 here of love your enemies. It says love your enemies, pray for those. That's from Matthew chapter 5. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? That first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. So I want us to read this verse together. It's going to be on the next slide. Based from last week, as we talked about that really tough commandment that Jesus gave us. So can we read that together? You have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. Wow, that's a tough message right there, isn't it? Goes against probably everything human in us, and that's why we need the divine. This year's Global Leadership Conference, there was a speaker by the name of Arthur C. Brooks. Arthur C. Brooks is a Harvard Business School professor, and he's also a Christian. And because the whole conference is about leadership, he actually came with a very surprising message. And out of it, he wrote a book, which I've been reading. It's just called Love Your Enemies. Love Your Enemies. And he gave an incredible message. And I just kind of let you know, I'm referring to some of his things this morning to help us. He actually teaches a class on happiness at Harvard Business School. How do you like that? And he's an incredible researcher. So he does all his homework about trends and what's happening in our world. And he says research is that in the last 20 years, people have gotten less happy. Is that a surprise to anybody? And I'm going to change his word a little bit, because I think sometimes we think happiness, sometimes happiness to us becomes circumstantial. I'm happy because of this and that, and now I'm not happy because of that. I think Jesus talks about it more like joy, contentment. It goes above and beyond the circumstances, and that's what he's really talking about. It's that general sense of happiness, of joy. And he actually comes up with some reasons back in the last 20 years. So one was the onslaught of smartphones. And he says, and I don't have any problem with smartphones. It's the way we use them is because of the problem. And what has become the problem is we have begun to isolate ourselves, right? To the expense of relationships and conversations. And then COVID hit, and it exasperated what that was causing, and loneliness began to be a part of it. He says, but now it seems like we're in this season of hate, almost. No wonder people aren't happy, right? He talks about anger. He's funny. He says, anger is not our problem. We see a growing amount of anger, I think, that happens out there. But he says, but anger is really not our problem. He goes, I'm married to a Spaniard. Trust me, anger is not our problem. And research shows that actually anger has nothing to do with divorce at all. It's something else. Because, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but he says, but what the problem is our anger has begun to move to disgust, which has moved to contempt. That's our problem, contempt. How are we different socially in the last 25 years? So I began to think about that, and so I don't mean to exclude anybody, but I'm thinking that for everybody here who's 45 and older, because then about 25 years ago you were about 20, because if you were like elementary school, you're probably not going to, but just go back a number of years, however that works for you, and Kathy and I were talking, my wife Kathy and I were talking about this and going, do you remember the conversation? Did we ever have any of these conversations when we were growing up like we're having today? Any of these divisive conversations? And like, no, we didn't, right? But today, politics is in everything. Activism is constant. Ideology pervades everything. You can't go to church without hearing about someone's ideology, kind of worldview. You know, you can't go to a coffee shop without hearing conversations about politics. And what he says is, this is by design. Sad statistic. 1 in 6 people in America today are not talking to a family member because of politics. How sad is that? And if that's you, by the way, he says, understand something. You are being used. Somebody wants you to hate. This has been the opportunity for people to take something that should be outside of our personal lives and inject it into everything we do, and it is lowering our contentment. Why? Because all we talk about are our areas of difference, about the conflict we have. And our neighbors, whom we should love, we don't like them because they voted for the other person. So this is probably the most political sermon you will ever hear from me without mentioning politics per se at all, right? But this is the culture. This is the purpose of this. I mean, we get an election coming up, and it's permeating everything. And this is the culture that you and I are called to be the church in, right? We need to understand it, and more importantly, not be like it, because we're to be in the world, but not in the world, but not of the world. Anger is not our problem. Anger actually is this hot emotion that says, I care what you think and I want it to change. Anger's not our problem. Like I said, anger has no correlation with divorce. It's anger that leads to disgust, that leads to contempt. So I'm going to give you a definition of contempt, because that's what we're going to talk about. Contempt is the conviction of the worthlessness of another person. Are you contemptuous of people who do not hold your views? Politically, ideology? Well, you might ask, well, how would I know that? Here's how. When that person is on the news, do you roll your eyes? Do you make a sarcastic, derisive comment? That will get you divorced, by the way. And it's giving us this collective desire for a societal divorce, which is the problem that we have. And it's destroying contentment here and around the world. So I've struggled with using this. It is the most obvious example I can give you. And yet, politically, and yet, because it's one-sided, you may be under the mistaken belief that that's the side I'm on. You don't know that because I'm not telling you that. It's just the most obvious example, and it's only happened on one side. So that's why I'm giving it, okay? Trump had an assassination attempt. And there were people that said, oh, if only he had been 1 inch to the left. And I had a conversation with someone I care about deeply. And I said, is that what we've come to? Where we're okay with the assassination of anybody, and we're all right with that? That's contempt. Do you understand? That is not Christ-like. That is not Jesus. But there are people who said that, felt that, thought that, And it is so unchristlike. It is destroying, contempt is destroying us all around the world. And we need to, as Christians, declare war on contempt. How do we do that? Well, some Christians would say we need to foster civility, and that's not it. Or we need to be more tolerant with one another. And I want to go, really? Think about that. Hey, listen, I'm a Christian, so I will tolerate you. Oh, man. Is that our standard? What do we need? What do we need in a polarized society that can't agree? It's a novel idea. I came up with it. Love your enemies. I did not come up with it, right? It's what Jesus told us. Love your enemies. That's a whole lot different than just tolerating, right? This is the teaching that changed the world because it is the hardest thing for us to do. But that's our edge as Christians, because it's the hardest thing to do. This is how we change the world, where we go out there, we find this hostility and hatred and contempt, and we bring love. I know. You don't feel it. Don't feel the love. I know. It doesn't matter. Love, if you get nothing else, get this. Love isn't a feeling, according to Scripture. And as Christians, we got to start realizing that Jesus' command to love isn't a feeling, because he's not going to command a feeling. Back in 1265, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the church fathers, said this: "To love is to will the good of the other." Didn't say to feel the love of the other, the good of the other. He says to will the good of the other. He doesn't talk about the feeling, he talks about the will. You don't feel love, good. You do it anyway. Because that's what Jesus says to do, not feel. It's an act, it's a decision. Some people would say, well, isn't it hypocritical? No, it's obedience. Jesus didn't say, like your enemies. That's kind of sentimental, you know? Jesus said, love, because guess what? When you choose to love, you're in control, and you can, it's the only then can you redeem your enemies and persuade your enemies and lift up your enemies. It's when you make the decision to act in love. So how do we do that? Well, Brooks, in his book, Love Your Enemies, gives some assignments that I thought were really practical for us as Christians and followers of Jesus to pay attention to. Of course, that's the foundation that he's speaking from anyway. And it's not to disagree less. Disagreement, in fact, is good. Disagreement can bring us to better ideas. Disagreement can challenge us. The problem is not disagreeing too much, it's disagreeing poorly. So first he says, and he uses this term, I kind of like, I'm going, but I understand where he took this term from the hippie days. He was thinking about his dad at the time, you know. You ready? First, you got to stand up to the man. The question is, who's the man today? The man is the person that says, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. You got to hate the person that disagrees with you politically. You got to hate the person that disagrees with you religiously. You got to hate the person that disagrees you on whatever issue that you feel passionate about. We got to stand up to that, because that's a problem. Because when you hate, someone is profiting and it's not you. That's why they do it. Because when they get you fired up, they make money, they win elections, they get more famous on Facebook or YouTube, and they get more powerful. And so the hard thing here is you got to turn off the people on your side, right? The ones you agree with who are saying contemptuous things, who are being un-Christ-like because they are pushing you to be un-Christ-like. Second one is, man, and this is harder. Get out of your bubble. You tend, this is not current. This is kind of like human nature. You know, we tend to listen to who we already agree with. I love listening to people who agree with me. Right? Come on, you do too. Kind of affirms what you believe and all of that stuff, and you know. But how many of us actually take the time to listen to the other side? Someone you disagree with. To a news station you disagree with. Maybe even have contempt for, the way I hear some of them talked about. Find someone you care about, someone you have a good relationship with, that disagrees with you, and actually have a conversation. Not necessarily a debate. It can get a little debating, but a conversation to try to understand each other. You know who I do that with best? It's my son Joshua. We don't disagree on a number of things. Ideologically, things spiritually we do, but ideologically, and we have these conversations that challenge me to think about what I already believe a bit. And I hope I do that for him. He's nodding, so that's good. And you know what happens? We walk away, we get to think about it, and we still love each other. You know? He's not my enemy. We can put ourselves in this bubble where we only listen to what we already agree with. And by the way, as a side, we do that as Christians as well sometimes. You know, let me ask you this question. Do you have any people in your life that you can have conversations with who are not believers? Are there any people in your life who are not Christians? You know, when I came here, when I was in New York, I had a group that I went to the gym with and met at the gym, and they were all over the place. And when I came here, after a few years, actually, because it wasn't really maybe until Joshua was in 5th or 6th grade, I realized I don't know anybody who's not from church. And that's a problem. And it's one of the reasons. There was a few reasons, but there was one of the reasons I started to take karate. Now, that was through Joshua, who took it after school. I wanted to do it together. There was something on my bucket list that I had not finished. But the other part was I need to be a part of a group outside the church. This is my unchurched community today. They keep me grounded in the world. They give me great sermon illustrations at times. And I tell them that, by the way. I'm going to preach on that Sunday. And they laugh because they know I would never say that in church. You know what they just said. But I have this amazing and challenging conversations. And yeah, I get to be a witness. And I get to pray for people. And third thing. As Christians, I think we need to learn to disagree better. You don't have to don't compromise. This is not saying compromise anything. Don't do that. But we're in this mess because of our contempt towards others. So don't disagree less, just disagree better by engaging in earnest debate while treating everybody with love and respect. You want to know how it's when it easily just becomes name calling? you know, first off, probably don't have a good argument, because that's what we resort to when we don't have something intellectual to say, you know. But basically, treat everyone with love and respect, because guess what? That's being like Jesus. We need to be the example. The church ought to be the example in this, not a part of the problem. When I say it permeates all of these areas, I have to tell you what, you know, here's a sermon illustration from yesterday, okay? Somebody stopped by the church and wanted to put up a political sign, didn't want to, was going to put up a political sign on our lawn. Okay? Not telling you who, because it doesn't matter. Now, I don't know who did it, but I'm not going to tell you who the political sign was for, because it doesn't matter. Fortunately, there's somebody from our church who was here and said, "What are you doing?" And made sure they did not. Well, you know, I heard your church believes, or this other church. Listen, we don't do that. Can you imagine what message that would be? And listen, we need to vote. You need to vote your God-given conscience on that's just being a good citizen, but allow God to inform it however he does that for you. But if we had a sign up, I don't care which side it was on, it would immediately tell everyone else who didn't believe that they're not welcome here. That is not a church. That is not Jesus. So I can't believe they were just going to put it there without permission. Like, can you imagine walking in this morning and going, "Can you believe this? I know who did it, and they're right from one of you." You know, it's just, you know. Here's the last one. We're done. Because I can't tell you how many times I've actually had to tell people this from the church. But you got to disconnect more from unproductive debates. It's good to be informed. Should be informed. Putting your head in the sand doesn't help anything. But the other difference between 25 years ago is we didn't have access to all the information that we have today. Good, bad, manipulative, whatever. We didn't have it. Remember that thing called the newspaper? That was it. Or radio, TV, news, ABC News, you know, Walter Cronkite, there we go, you know. But today, so listen, I've had people, you know, we don't need to be doing this information thing 24/7. It's addictive. You might find it's an addiction. But I've had people tell me, "I'm getting so angry." Well, if that's you, you need to disconnect. That's what I've been, and some do, some don't. I did. I needed to disconnect, at least to the level that I was a year or 2, 3 ago. I got to stop watching, listening to all this stuff. It affects you. It permeates you, and you're being used in that. Okay? So here's something radical. Stop talking, thinking about politics completely for a while. Do a politics cleanse. Take a week off. Resolve not to read, watch, or listen to anything about politics. No conversations. That's hard to do. But if you do that, you know what I think you'll find? First off, you'll probably find you really didn't miss anything. If something major happens, you're still going to hear about it. Chances are it's not. So you didn't really miss anything. Nothing will have changed, but you might find yourself less angry, less stressed, more at peace, feeling the joy and the abundant life Jesus really wants for you and died for you for. It's about loving your enemies. Love your enemies. Say that again. Love your enemies. So this is what Jesus calls us to. Love your neighbor. Love as I have loved you, he says. Even love your enemy. Because there are too many Christians right now that have allowed themselves to be led by a spirit of contempt. Too many Christians who are actually judging brothers and sisters in Christ's salvation on politics. Horrible. You really need to do a heart check if you're doing that. Politics is temporary. 4 years is going to be somebody else. Jesus is eternal. In his book, Brooks quotes on one of his kids' favorite childhood books. I never heard of it. Maybe you have. It's called The Most Important Book. Kind of an arrogant title, I think, but The Most Important Book. It's by Margaret Wise Brown. So he quotes a snippet. It says this. And this is sort of like the template, I think, probably for the whole book on different things. He just says, the important thing about rain is that it's wet. It falls out of the sky, it sounds like rain, makes things shiny, does not taste like anything, and it is the color of air. But the most important thing about rain is that it's wet. And I'm sure throughout that book, it just takes different things other than rain. And so Arthur Brooks writes his own verse in the style of Margaret Wise Brown. Here it is. I thought it would be a really good thing to hear. The important thing about contempt is that it is bad for us. Sometimes we don't like people who disagree with us. We want to tell them they're idiots, and social media makes it easy to do. And pundits get rich by doing it. And maybe it seems that some of them deserve our contempt. But the important thing about contempt is it is bad for us. He begins to close his book by saying the title is misleading. And I agree. Love your enemies. The problem he's addressing is that we are constantly hearing that those we disagree with are our enemies. And too many people have begun to believe this. But in reality, they aren't my enemies at all. They're just simply people whom I disagree with. Think about how Jesus would respond to any people, right? So as a follower of Jesus, can I just suggest this? When you get up for the day, pray a prayer for courage from God. Pray something like this. Look, Lord, I don't know what I'm going to find today, what I'm going to encounter today. But Lord, give me love no matter what I find. Walk with me. Not just lift me up when I'm feeling down, but so that I can lift someone else up when there is hostility and anger. Give me the words when I see the contempt to show the love. By the way, that's God's gift to you. And through you, it's God's gift to the world. How do I know? Because in Matthew 5:44, there's this teaching that we should love our enemies, and we would not have been given that command if Jesus did not promise to give us courage and strength to do it with his help. Love your enemy. Remember last week I asked, write down the name of your enemy, or it could be a group or anything else. You need to take that. I was actually having a conversation with Sam. I almost had us write it down, pass it in, and put it in a paper shredder right here. Because are they really your enemy? Are they God's enemy? You know? In a world right now, loving your enemy is so hard to find. You know what that means? We get to be the light. We get to be the light of the world that Jesus calls us to, which is also why Jesus tells us, and they will know you're my disciples when they see your love. God, help us to be in this world, but not of the world. You have called us to be in the world. You have called us to be light. We can't do that when we're in darkness ourselves. Help us Lord, to be your light in this world that seems so divisive and angry and full of hate and just divided. And help us to model, God, something better, something powerful. We can disagree and still love. Help us to realize, God, this is all temporary. Let's not treat it like it's eternal. You're eternal. Your kingdom is eternal. You're our king, no matter who gets elected. We're yours. And we're your missionaries in this world, particularly at this time, Lord. Help us to love. Amen.